I'm John Dolmer, Director of Community Development. This is Dr. Margaret Banyan, who will be running the festivities for tonight, discussing the city's evaluation and appraisal comprehensive plan amendments. The schedule was up on the screen. It'll be up there in a second. I am simply here to provide emotional support and an introduction, and I'm off to another event, but you are in capable hands with someone that has been helping the city for many years, and we have always appreciated her work.
Thank you.
I will get out of her way and let her get started.
Thanks, John.
Thank you all for coming tonight.
So what we're going to do is just a short presentation, and then with the rest of our team, Rosemarie and Shelley right here, we're all going to divide up into 3 separate tables, and you can just walk around and give us some feedback, ask any questions that you have about the process, or sort of what we think is on the horizon. And then we have about an hour set aside for that. And then we're going to take about a half-hour break. And then we're going to repeat the process. So we're not going to have you here until 8:30 unless you would like to stay. So you're welcome to repeat the process, stay the whole time. But that's what we're doing, is we're just going to repeat the presentation again starting at 7:15. So the purpose of that is just to maximize people's time available if they have work things that they were doing later on. So that's kind of the strategy for tonight. Okay? All right. Good. So I'm going to go through just the first part of the presentation, and then I'll hand it over to Shelley. And some of this, so if you were at the city council meeting last night or had a chance to listen in, some of this will be a little bit repeated information. So what we have done in our history with these amendment processes is every 7 years, the state requires that cities and counties do a evaluation and appraisal review. And in that process, the goal is to look through the whole comprehensive plan and look for 3 things. We looked for 3 things. The first was anything that conflicted with state law. And the second was anything that, any changes that would need to be made as a result of annexation. And then the third was any what we call optional amendments. Because the state says if you're going to have a comprehensive plan for 7 years, it's advisable to go back and evaluate to see how well it's performing and whether it's meeting the city's or county's needs. So we did that process. We completed it in 2016. And then what happens after that is the state gives you a year to make any amendments that are required by the state. So we did that in 2017. We made a series of amendments to be consistent with state law. And then we still had a few changes left to make with the state required amendments that we had planned to phase in. And so those we are going to be working on. City Council last night directed us to complete those fall of 2019. So sometime in the fall we'll be going through the amendment process with the City Council for the state required amendments. And one element that was in the optional bucket, and that's the transportation element. So the reason why they chose those 2 is because we've got some other provisions in the comprehensive plan that are required to be changed by the state. Do you want to talk about concurrency, or do you want me to talk about it? About your thing? So one of the changes, I'll try to, because concurrency can be kind of complicated, but kind of in a nutshell, the state says that if you have a development come in and you don't have the adequate infrastructure to serve that development, then the city could deny the development. So that's what the state used to say. So it used to be transportation related, it used to be water, sewer, schools. But the state changed that. And the state said no longer is transportation in schools required. In other words, you couldn't deny a permit if there was failing infrastructure for transportation and schools. But you had to have a way to allow developers to pay to mitigate that development. So developers had to have a way to pay for any new transportation infrastructure. So you can no longer deny a permit based on transportation in schools. So we've had to make changes to what the city requires based on those two elements. Is that a clear enough explanation? Did I miss something? Okay. So that's what's happening with the state required amendments. We're going to be working on those, hopefully transmitting them around fall. And then we'll start to work on what we call the optional amendments. And Shelley's going to talk a little bit more about what we think the strategy is with those optional amendments. So that'll be future land use and housing. We anticipate moving through the process during season with those and completing those around May of next year. So you'll see next season more public meetings associated with future land use and housing. And maybe some transportation if there's some conflicts, because, and Shelley will talk about this a little bit more, those three elements are tied together. So when we talk about mitigating traffic and reducing the cars on the road, we have to have places where people can walk to, right? So you have to start thinking about land use a little bit better. Same thing with housing. If you have all your workforce living in a different part of the county or in another county, they're going to be driving to work in Bonita Springs. So we have to think about the impact of housing on traffic and transportation. So those three elements are tied together in ways that we need to think strategically about them together. Here I talked a little bit about the three buckets and what we think we'll be working on. The first is the state required, and we're going to be working on coastal high hazard map. The state made some changes to what we have to provide with that map. We're going to be working on concurrency, transportation concurrency, and we're going to be working on some small little amendments regarding how we express the acreage in certain land use categories. So it's not changing any land use categories, it's not adding acreage. It's the last point is, it was sort of a typo that we need to fix. So in annexation related categories, there's a few things that we need to address. Those would be next spring. There is some annexed properties that do not have a city land use designation. So we need to assign them one, which means we'll have to change the future land use map at that time. And then there's some other related goals and objectives policies that may need to be addressed because of the annexed lands. Then finally, in the optional amendments, we're going to look at the future land use element and the map series. So if you look at the comprehensive plan and the future land use element, there's about 10 maps, 9 or 10 maps. So in the optional amendments, future land use element and the maps, some of the maps are pretty out of date in the future land use element. So we need to make sure they're up to date and the most current. Most of those maps are not driven by the city. Several of them are from external sources, but it's still important to have the most updated maps in the comp plan. And then the transportation element, that was in the optional bucket before. There's also more maps there, and those maps are also out of date, so we need to update them. And then the housing element and other related goals, objectives, policies we'll be working on. The main emphasis is on those first three. But we can't have a comprehensive plan that conflicts with itself, so we need to look at the other elements to make sure that what we change in the first three doesn't have conflicts in the rest of the comprehensive plan. So that's the pretty high-level overview. I think maybe your slides are next? Yeah. So Shelley's going to come up and kind of talk about what we think the strategies are going to be for looking at those first three elements. Thank you.
So I'm Shelley Johnson. I'm a planner with Insight. We're located in Fort Myers, and I worked with Margaret, or we worked with Margaret, on the evaluation and appraisal report back in 26, which was worked on in 2016. So this is kind of a refresher course maybe for all of us, because it's been a while since I looked at all this. But so the optional amendments, the idea behind optional amendments is, as Margaret said, they aren't required by the state. They are amendments that the effort is to uphold the vision that the city has for itself. So, you know, back a few years ago, the city established a vision for the city of Bonita Springs to promote economic development, to be a viable community, beautification. There were a lot of things that were talked about. And so, you know, the first step in getting there is to establish the higher level policies that sort of create the framework for the implementation of tools that allow that to happen. And so the optional amendments are things that that the city wants, not the state or anyone else really. And we've identified quite a few things to look at, but just to highlight, you know, one of the vision elements that the city had was to encourage redevelopment and infill, so that we don't continue this kind of the sprawl effect that's very characteristic of Southwest Florida. So the idea here is to create policies that encourage the redevelopment and infill of properties that either are still vacant and internal to the city's boundaries, or have structures on them that have aged out and maybe need to be redeveloped, and also identifying areas that maybe the city wants to have redeveloped, and how do we incentivize that to happen. So those are kind of generally the things that we would look at in terms of redevelopment and infill development. And then the old US 41 redevelopment overlay, which is the downtown. I like to call it the downtown. I don't know if you're aware of it now, but the city is working on a form-based code for downtown. It's a different regulatory document for how the downtown will be built in terms of its shape, its form, and its function. And the comprehensive plan needs to establish some, again, higher level policies that support that form of development. It's a unique form of development. For example, you know, typically what we're all familiar with is if you're going to build a house, there's a front yard setback or a rear yard setback. There's a minimum setback from the street. When you're trying to rebuild a downtown, you want buildings to come up to the street. So just as a concept, the form-based code is all about where do we place structures in order to create this synergy within a downtown that makes it vibrant and encourages sort of a mix of uses that happen within not only from property to property, but within one property itself. So that if you think about a downtown, you might have offices or retail on the first floor, offices on a second floor, and then a residential component on a third floor. So the form-based code that they're working on now is moving in that direction. The policies in the comp plan don't really address that at this time, and so that's part of what we'll be looking at, is how do we build support at the higher policy level to be able to implement the form-based code without creating conflicts between the two. So for example, if you were to look at the comp plan now, I think, you know, there may be some height limitations or yard areas that may be established that don't really jive with that type of development form. And so those are the kinds of things that we would be looking at to clean up and sort of mirror the effort. Aesthetics, there's been a lot of talk about aesthetics, and in particular along main corridors. So, you know, in order to, if you will, obligate the city to beautify as they go, create walkable corridors, not just for vehicles, but for pedestrians and bicyclists, and kind of create gateways into beautiful gateways into the city, there has to be some policies in place that sort of establish what is that vision that we're trying to accomplish, and how do we get there. And in that sense, when a road is redeveloped or a new roadway corridor is developed, there are some policies in place that the design of that particular road has to be consistent with. So it kind of forces the issue, if you will, of ensuring that the beautification, the aesthetics are part of the design. And I don't mean to bash the high school, but it's really a good example of the lack of aesthetics. I'm sure all of you experienced coming in here. This is the first time I've been to this high school, but it's sort of a no man's land. There's no trees, there's no, welcome sign. The roads kind of go everywhere. Like I had to turn around a couple of times to figure out where I was. So that's the kind of thing, you don't really want your city to develop that way. It's a much more inviting and prosperous look if you have a well-designed corridors. So. And then, as Margaret mentioned, updating the map series, the future land use and the transportation maps are a little bit outdated. They don't reflect everything that's on the ground necessarily, or the type of uses that are allowed in certain areas. And so we'll be looking at that and how those maps need to be updated. That's pretty much a minor component to the whole thing. I think that might be it. Let's see.
Oh, you have.
Do I have more? Oh, look at that. Okay.
Yeah, you have like 2 whole more slides.
So the transportation concurrency, Margaret pretty much talked about that. I don't know that I need to repeat that. The complete streets is kind of what I've been talking about with beautification, where we look at streets as not only for vehicles, but we look at them as a multimodal corridor that encourages alternative forms of transportation. And then, again, as Margaret said, the housing, the transportation, and the land use components of the comp plan really need to work together in order to identify, where should the most dense housing occur, or where are the future roads going to be needed. Like you have to understand where you're directing growth in order to plan for the transportation and plan for the housing. And most of these bullet points are kind of talking to that. Develop a multimodal level of service standard, which we've kind of talked about. De-emphasizing traffic. It's hard to overcome in here, but there is a mindset that we're just trying to move vehicles from point A to point B, and so the mindset kind of needs to be changed a little bit. That's not the only way to get around, and how do we create safe mechanisms and safe ways of using alternative forms of transportation. Okay. And then the housing element, again, talking about, as I said, these 3 elements are all related, and how do we balance all that and direct them all into the same pattern of growth. And at the same time protecting neighborhood quality so that we don't have encroachment of adverse uses into neighborhoods, either established or new neighborhoods, and making sure that all of these uses remain compatible. I don't recall that there's that many policies excuse me, in the comp plan now about energy conservation. Obviously, probably a growing topic of discussion with the climate, the conversations on climate change, and how do we bring that down to the local level? Okay, I think that's it. Does anybody have any questions for me? We're going to break out into groups, so we'll have some chance.
What do you consider adverse uses?
Well, an example would be an industrial use being developed immediately adjacent to a residential neighborhood. Where there may be noise or odor or those types of adverse impacts.
What about a mine?
A mine could, of course. I mean, that could be an adverse impact also, depending on where it is in proximity to other uses that are considered compatible or not compatible.
Well, are these defined? Are just what you
No, we're not there yet. I mean, we will be looking at how all those things are interrelated when we start putting together policies.
We're going to have a poster over here, And Rosemary's gonna take that, and she's gonna just take any notes or suggestions you have for housing. Kind of knowing, are there strategies that we're missing, something else you would like to see? I'll take the transportation element, so if anybody wants to talk about transportation, I'll be over here on that little table behind you. And then Shelley's gonna take the future land use element, and you can talk with Shelley about anything annexation related, or what else, downtown related, and you can talk with Shelley about that. Where do you want to be?